Bay Area Focus. I'm your host, Kenny Choi, filling in for Michelle Griego today. We would love to hear some show ideas, so please go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/Bay Area Focus and comment to the page. Today, we're going to hear from an author and the future of technology, an organization bringing traditional music and dance from around the world, and a documentary illuminating the Bay Area housing crisis. But up first, we have Sasha Chanoff. He's the author of From Crisis to Calling, Finding Your Moral Center in the Toughest Decisions. And in this book, you talk about some of the issues that we face with refugees around the world, millions of them. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the book is based on a life and death decision that I faced during a U.S. government rescue operation in the Congo, where this was violence in the Congo that came essentially from the Rwandan genocide, where people of the Tutsi tribe were being massacred. The U.S. government contracted my employer at the time to send small rescue teams in to evacuate people who were being massacred. My boss handed me a list with 112 names on it and said he's sending me in on the last rescue mission. The job was to get those people, and under no circumstances could my colleague and I, who was my partner on this mission, include anybody else on that flight out, because if we did, we'd jeopardize the 112 lives. We flew into the Congo, we rented a car and a driver and went to this safe haven where these 112 people who were being attacked were protected, and we registered them. But as we were trying to leave, somebody working there pointed us to a tent and said, "You have to see the new people who just came into this safe compound. They're in that tent." We said, "We can't go in, we can't look at anybody else," but my colleague stepped into that tent and I followed her. And in that tent were 32 widows and orphans. They had been put in an execution center, not because they'd done anything wrong. They were innocent civilians who were being attacked and blamed for the country's problems. Many of their family members had been killed. They were barely alive. They were emaciated and traumatized, and we knew if we left them, they'd die. But if we tried to take them, we'd jeopardize the 112 people that we knew we could get out.
And so you had to make a decision. What happened?
My colleague said, "We have to try to take them," but my boss had given me explicit instructions that we can't take anybody else, and if my colleague tries to take anyone, I have to stop her. And so I told her we couldn't, and we argued all night, and she finally said, "Sasha, we're humanitarians. We see these people face to face. This is our decision." And she convinced me. And we called our boss and we told him what we needed to do, and he got very upset, but he finally said, "This is a U.S. government operation. Get the U.S. ambassador's approval and try it." We managed to get all those people out, and they came to the U.S. through our government's refugee resettlement program. I've watched them now rebuild their lives here. It's 16 years later. But that experience for me changed my life.
Right.
It helped.
How so?
Well, it helped me, I think, define who I was. I realized everywhere I went across Africa working with refugees, I was tuned into those people who were off the radar, who were unseen. So, for example, when I worked on the resettlement of the Sudanese Lost Boys, a famous group of refugees here in the U.S. who came from Kakuma refugee camp in northern Kenya, I found many girls who had the same exact experience as the boys. They too should have been identified, but they were overlooked because they didn't have access to services in that camp, and they were being sold into marriage against their will and at risk. So I started an organization, Refuge Point, to find and identify those people who are the most at risk, to make sure that they have access to safety and solutions.
And Sasha, I think one of the shocking things that I read about the refugee crisis is that around the world there are 65 million refugees in this world. That's a huge number, because you're talking about a few hundred that were in the Congo.
Yeah, it's more people displaced right now than at any point in history. And another trend that is very terrible is that the average amount of time someone is a refugee is nearing 20 years. So people who flee their homes from Syria, from Congo, from Somalia, from South Sudan, from Afghanistan are not going home for an average of 20 years. So we have to rethink the whole effort to address refugee issues. We have to find ways for refugees to become contributors to society. These are people who are actually entrepreneurs. They're contributors. All they want to do is rebuild their lives.
So where does the government play in? Where is the resistance coming from? What does the government do? What's the solution? I know it's a question that you might not be able to solve or answer very quickly, but what's the solution?
Well, tomorrow I'm speaking at President Obama's Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and he's also coming to speak. But this September, President Obama is going to speak about the need to increase resettlement for refugees to the U.S. and countries around the world. He's also going to talk about the need to increase access to education and work opportunities for refugees who have fled to a neighboring country and need to rebuild there.
Did you see a lot of resistance from those who might say, well, if you're going to bring in refugees, you're hurting the economy, or you could jeopardize homeland security with people who you don't know that are coming into the country?
I see a lot of fear-mongering in the political rhetoric that I think is extremely dangerous. Refugees right now in the U.S. are actually being threatened and sometimes attacked because of the rhetoric against them. The fact is that of the millions of people who come to the U.S. every year through immigration channels, refugees have the most complex and difficult process to get here. They go through organizations like mine, Refuge Point, spend a year or more getting to know people where they are. Then we refer them to the U.S. government. The U.S. government then, Department of Homeland Security officials undertake multiple screening interviews. These are people who are specially trained to detect fraud and detect any situations where people shouldn't come here. After that, they go through screening security checks that can take years. The average amount of time for someone to come here is 2 years through the refugee program. Nobody who wants to do harm to us is going to try to get through that channel. There are many far easier channels to come through.
Sasha, Chanoff, thank you so much for joining us here this morning. The book is called From Crisis to Calling, Finding Your Moral Center in the Toughest Decisions. For more information about Refuge Point and From Crisis to Calling, you can log on to refugepoint.org. That's refugepoint.org. We'll be back with more Bay Sunday after this break.